Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Cambridge English Teacher webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome Tom Heaven as today's presenter. Tom's been living in Berlin and working as an English teacher for 4 years. He's a member of the Berlin Language Workers Grassroots Association, with which he ran the first Lesson Jam sessions. Over to you, Tom.
Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in to listen to me talk about lesson jamming today. I hope that the ideas that I talk about will be relevant to your context and that you will be able to take some or all of those ideas away to use with your fellow teachers. As Alistair said, I work in Berlin. I'm talking to you from my flat in Berlin this afternoon. It's 4 p.m. here. I finished work about 2 hours ago. I'm a freelance English teacher, so I work for different schools and companies, and I've been living and teaching in Berlin since 2011. I'm originally from Birmingham in the UK, and as Alistair said, I'm a member of the Berlin Language Worker Grassroots Association, or Berlin GAS for short. I'll talk a little bit more about the organisation later on. Being a freelance teacher in Berlin has its drawbacks. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment and the importance of the Berlin context for some of the ideas that have gone into lesson jamming. First of all, though, I'd just like to tell you what you can expect me to say in the next 40 or so minutes. I'll begin by briefly outlining what a lesson jam is and the stages involved. If you have a pen and paper on hand, it might be a good idea to jot down the stages for reference during the rest of my talk. In the second part, I will then talk about why the lesson jamming idea was developed and the context it was developed in. Then I will talk a bit more about what lesson jamming is. I will explain the 5 stages in more detail with the help of some of my drawings. I know that I usually need things to be explained to me at least twice. During the 4th part, I will talk about the 4 lesson jams that I've been involved in and show you a few photographs. Finally, I will talk about ideas and plans for the future. I intend to finish well within the time limit to give all of you the chance to ask questions. Okay, so what is a lesson jam? It is essentially lesson planning in groups. Until I started holding lesson jams with the Berlin GAS group, I'd always planned lessons on my own without the help of other professionals. Let's say that I believe in the saying that 2 minds, or 3 or 4 minds, are better than 1. So, lesson jamming is a type of distilled brainstorming. I like brainstorming because you can do it in groups and it involves a lot of quick, uninhibited thinking. From my point of view, it normally has some downsides, which I tried to edit out when developing the lesson jamming concept. Sharing ideas and experience really links lesson jamming and brainstorming. By planning together and thinking in an open way, I hope that participants have lots of opportunities to share their ideas and experience with others and to learn from one another. So here are the 5 stages of a lesson jam. pens and paper at the ready. So you can see that it starts with a stimulus, and then there's some brainstorming, feedback, lesson planning, and a presentation at the end. The stimulus is usually an object. For example, it could be an apple. It is this object that the participants will base their ideas around for the brainstorming. One object is given to each group. You should try to give them a real object so that they can touch and look at it, maybe even taste, smell, or hear it as well. The participants write down the first thing that comes into their minds in association with this object. It's very important that you have an even number of groups, as otherwise the third stage will not work. So the second stage, brainstorming. Each group has been given an object, they have their stimulus. Now let each member of the group brainstorm on their own with their own piece of paper for 3 minutes. After 3 minutes, bring each group together and allow the group 17 minutes to brainstorm together. Each group should have a piece of flip chart paper between them to write on and some nice thick marker pens, preferably different colours. So the third stage. After brainstorming, each group links up with another group. This is why you need an even number of groups. Each group shows the other group their piece of paper with their ideas and explains them. The other group gives feedbacks and suggestions. After 10 minutes, the groups swap roles. So stage 4, this is planning. Each group now has 45 minutes to write a plan of their lesson on a second piece of flip chart paper. It is at this stage that the teachers have to think about lesson goals, learner levels, and lesson length, etc. And then finally, the fifth stage of presentation. At the end, each group presents their finished plans to the other groups. Each group should have at least 5 minutes to present. Don't worry if you haven't quite got it all yet. I'm going to go through the stages again in a moment. So why? Teaching can be a lonely business. As I've already said, before we started lesson jamming, I'd done all my lesson planning on my own. In the Berlin context, where many teachers are working as freelancers for different schools and companies, the feeling of loneliness is amplified. Many teachers don't even know their colleagues from the schools that they work at because they don't work the same hours as them. When you're not being paid, there's little incentive to hang around. You probably need to be on to the next job anyway, and that job might be a long bus or train ride away. I joined the Berlin Language Worker Grassroots Association, or Berlin GAS, last summer. It's an organisation that was set up with the aim of improving working conditions for language workers, and especially teachers in Berlin. Lesson jamming fits in with this goal by bringing teachers together to talk and support one another, and not to see each other as a competition. If we are to have any chance of improving working conditions in Berlin, we'll all need to get to know each other and work together. Without the support of the other teachers in the group, lesson jamming wouldn't have become a reality. Paul Walsh, Tihana Romanek, and Teresa Gorman were all instrumental in the planning for and organisation of the first 2 lesson jams, which took place in Berlin. I'm the one here talking today, but lesson jamming, in the form that I'm presenting it to you today, developed out of the experience of putting on those first two events and the involvement of all the participants in the lesson jams to date. But why lesson jamming specifically in this form? Well, I've been to many very interesting, creative and productive workshops and talks from which I've learnt a lot. There are many English teachers out there who are very good at talking about and passing on their knowledge and experience to audiences. But sometimes, when I went to these talks or workshops, I imagined how good it would be if just once in a while it was possible to really tap the knowledge and experience of all the other teachers in the room. The people sitting next to me, the people in front of me, and the people behind me. So I tried to think of a way that the skills of a whole group could be used. How can we learn from one another? I wanted to find a way that teachers could work creatively together in groups and in the process learn from one another. To do this, I wanted to provide as little input as possible. In fact, if you come to one of my lesson jams, I'm the one you'll probably learn the least from. I'm the one who brings a flip chart paper, makes sure any computers are working, and makes the tea and coffee. Given the right conditions, I believe that almost everyone, if not everyone, can be creative. And that you don't need to be an extroverted genius to display signs of creativity. In a group, everyone can play a role in the creative process. For example, when musicians jam, something creative happens. But yet, I haven't heard of a musician who jams alone. It's a group activity. And I'm no musician, but from what I understand of jamming, the musicians start with a short piece of music that members of the group react to and develop as a group. The role of a drummer is different from that of the guitarist, but take one out of the mix and the jam isn't the same anymore. So what are the right conditions for a lesson jam? I wanted an idea that can be explained and realized as simply as possible. I started off thinking about brainstorming. It's an idea that doesn't take much explaining. Everyone's familiar with brainstorming. You write down the first ideas that come to your mind without considering their practicality too much. A problem that I've always identified with brainstorming, though, is that it generates a page full of ideas and a lot of energy, but if those ideas and energy aren't focused, it isn't ultimately very productive. But yet, at the same time, if your focus is too tight early on, it is difficult to think with an open mind, as you always have one eye on the goal. So I split the whole thing into 3 stages. There's a stage of brainstorming, where participants should think associatively. There's a stage where another group gives feedback and evaluation on what they think of the other group's ideas. It is only after this stage of evaluation that each group should start thinking about identifying a finished lesson plan and concentrating on the goal. There are different roles in a lesson jam as well that can be taken up. Whether you're stronger at coming up with wacky ideas, evaluating the strengths or weaknesses of others' ideas, or pulling existing ideas into some type of shape. For example, I can't think and talk very well at the same time. Sometimes when I'm a member of a group, I find it difficult to know where to begin and what to say. So with people like me in mind, there's 3 minutes of individual brainstorming right at the beginning. Okay, so let's move on to look at the 5 stages in a bit more detail. I haven't spoken about the stimulus very much so far. This is the first stage, but it is at the very core of a lesson jamming concept. I don't want to become too theoretical at this point, but by presenting a real object for teachers to brainstorm on, I wanted to provide a focus for their activity, but yet something that can be interpreted in a variety of different ways, even perhaps in a way that precedes the name that we usually give that object. For this example, I've taken an apple. Unfortunately, due to the virtual nature of this webinar, I can't reach out to you and put a real apple in your hand, but just imagine that. You have a real apple in your hand. And so you can put yourself in the position of the character on this slide. He has 3 minutes to brainstorm on the apple in his hand. You can see he scratches his head and he thinks about the big apple, or Apple Mac, or A for apple, B for banana, or the saying, as American as apple pie. And then he notes his ideas down. Pretty soon his 3 minutes are up and he joins his group to continue brainstorming. And here we can see that one person from his group has connected the idea of the apple with Apple Records. Apple Records is a record company that the famous British rock group the Beatles set up. And we can see that the other members of the group are responding to this idea. Good idea. And so we can see that this chap writes down John and Yoko. John Lennon was the lead singer in the Beatles, also the guitarist, and Yoko Ono, a well-known conceptual artist in her own right, was his wife. How about someone else responds to that by writing the Ballad of John and Yoko? It's a song by the Beatles about John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Or here we can see our original jammer with the apple in his hand, and he suggests a theme of record company meetings. So from that original stimulus, lots of ideas and chains of ideas have been generated. In a real lesson jam, there are many other ideas as well. But in our lesson jam, the first 20 minutes are up, and our group meets with another group for a bit of feedback. So to begin with, the lady at the bottom says, I prefer this idea. And then we have a chap in the turquoise shirt who says, or asks, what's that about? And then another person says, that's a good idea. At this point, the group on the right might add a few of their own ideas, but they're helping the first group by identifying good ideas, asking questions, and providing encouragement. In a real lesson jam, the roles would then be swapped, and the group on the left would evaluate the group on the right's ideas. Before the next stage, the planning stage, I usually include a break of about 15 minutes for tea, coffee, biscuits, and whatever else. An apple maybe. During the next stage, the planning stage, the groups have 45 minutes to write up their plans, based on their own brainstorming and the feedback from the other group. Here we can see that our group has written up their plan and are presenting it. It has moved on a long way from the original Apple stimulus. This group has fixed on the idea of John and Yoko, as we can see. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not really the end lesson plan that is the most important part of lesson jamming. It's great to have a goal, and it's also good at the end of a session that the result is a group product. But what's more important is the interaction between teachers that precedes the finished lesson plan. Through these interactions, teachers learn from each other and teach each other. Let's see some of these interactions in place. I'm going to show you a few photos from past lesson jams next. So this is a poster for the first lesson jam. It took place on the 13th of September 2014. You can see that I've tried to make it as attractive and simple as possible, while still including all the information and giving a very broad outline of what a lesson jam is about. The other members of the group that I'm a member of, Berlin Gas, had a big role to play in organising this first one. We talked the idea through together, we planned the event together, we promoted the event through the group's Facebook page and our other networks. We each acted as facilitators to groups. Without the support of GAS, the first lesson jam simply wouldn't have taken place. And here we see a picture of the first lesson jam. We also had Dale Coulter, who's the head of the English Language Teachers Association Berlin and Brandenburg, LTAB, to thank for the venue, which was a school that he used to work at. I felt a real sense of relief after this first session because the idea worked in practice. We could see that the separate elements worked, led to an end lesson plan, and that the participants all seemed to be having fun and working with each other well, and even staying around afterwards to chat to each other. The evaluation forms also bore these impressions out. The session really showed us the need to keep on top of timing for each stage though. We struggled to get through the activities and finish on time. It meant that the planning stage had to be cut short and one group didn't completely finish their plan. Regarding the timing, I think that you could easily extend a lesson jam over 4 or 5 hours. But I always feel keenly aware that the participants are giving up their own time to attend the session, so far always on a Saturday. For this reason, all the lesson jams so far have only been 3 hours. You can see that the next lesson jam was once again between 11 AM and 2 PM. This jam took place at another venue, once again thanks to help from LTAB. This time the events manager, Mandy Welfare, helped us out. It was a co-working space that also has an events room. A little bit bigger and lighter than the last venue. What was also good was that it had a cafe downstairs that participants could escape to during the break and fuel up on espressos and chocolate muffins. If you're interested in putting on a lesson jam or a similar event, put a bit of thought into the venue as well and how well it will accommodate the participants. In this slide, you can see the effect that some discipline around timing had. A well-presented, visually appealing and logical lesson plan. After the first lesson jam, we were so happy with the way that it had worked out that we put in an application to talk about it at IATEFL in Manchester. The happiness was doubled when the application was accepted. So, 7 months to the day after the first lesson jam took place, I spoke to an audience of fellow teachers from around the world about lesson jamming as part of the Teacher Development SIG Day at IATEFL. It was at IATEFL that Karen Momber of Cambridge University Press heard me speaking and invited me to speak today. But I also met Liz Jolliffe from Frankfurt and Maha Hassan from Cairo. IATEFL was a great way to share the lesson jam idea and also to allow it to develop. As you're about to see, Frankfurt and Cairo were the venues for the next 2 lesson jams. By the way, I'll also be at the next IATEFL. It's taking place in my home city of Birmingham. Birmingham's twin city is Frankfurt am Main, by the way. So I felt very much at home making the 5.5-hour trip by train to Frankfurt. The workshop was held on behalf of the English Language Teachers Association Frankfurt. And I took a little piece of Berlin with me. You can see that the teachers in this picture are holding and looking at a tin of currywurst, which is a type of sausage in sauce that is very popular in Berlin. From this they developed a lesson plan about fast living and cooking from scratch. It was really reassuring to see that lesson jamming also worked beyond Berlin. These teachers had travelled some distances from surrounding towns to come to the session. They really appreciated the chance to engage with teachers of different levels of experience. Once again, the feedback was very positive. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the next lesson jam, because to make it happen, I had to make a few changes. Since meeting Maha Hassan at IATEFL, I'd been thinking about how the teachers that she worked with could have a go at lesson jamming as well. I'd given a short talk to her group, which is called Maha ESL Training, via Skype, and they were very enthusiastic about the idea. Of course, Maha could have put on a lesson jam herself in the same way that had been done in Berlin and Frankfurt. But I wanted to link teachers in Berlin with teachers in Cairo to provide them all with an even greater possibility for exchange. And Skype was the obvious answer. You can see Maha in the top left of this picture, by the way, with a laptop next to her. Skype also had its limitations though. I didn't want to use it for the brainstorming and planning stages in which the participants use flipchart paper. It would have slowed down the process too much, as the participants in Cairo and those in Berlin could not share the same piece of paper. So instead of using Skype for the full 3 hours, we used it for specific parts of the jam. First to introduce ourselves, then the cameras were turned away and the stimuli were presented and the brainstorming took place. The cameras were again used for stage 3. The Cairo group gave feedback to Berlin on the brainstorming ideas that they presented, and vice versa. The cameras were again turned away for the 45 minutes of the stage 4 lesson planning. And the cameras were used for the final time for the presentation of the lesson plans. So just to recap, for the lesson jam with Cairo, we used Skype for introductions, then at stage 3 for feedback, and then at stage 5 for presentation of lesson plans. The end result, though, was the same. This is Team Berlin's lesson plan. A Skype lesson jam was something new. There is more that could go wrong. So I limited the numbers to one group in Cairo and one group in Berlin. This also meant that I could put on the Berlin side in my flat. I was really glad when the feedback was positive once again. Through the 4 lesson jams that have taken place so far, I've been collecting evaluation forms after each session. And here you can see I've collated the important points that came up more than once on this slide. So to begin with the positives. One was the exposure to a range of knowledge and styles of other teachers. Another was the flexibility of approach, in that there is no prescribed content goal at the beginning. And then the opportunity to share with others and take from others was something that other participants really saw as something positive. So the points for improvement. These are the bits that I find most interesting, to be honest. Timing. This really came out of the first lesson jam, not having enough time to finish. As I've already mentioned, you need to keep a check on time. Having said that, the last lesson jam with Cairo overran, but everyone must have enjoyed it because no one complained about it. Similar target groups, especially at the first 2 lesson jams in Berlin, a couple of participants said that they would have liked to have been with teachers who teach English for the same purpose. For example, business English. It's difficult to provide for this in smaller groups, but if you have a large number of teachers, it's something that you could bear in mind. What I really liked in Frankfurt was that the groups self-organized to provide a mix of experience in their groups. And then the final point for improvement, a short teaching component added to the end of the presentation. It's something that I usually suggest at the beginning of each jam, but not all groups include it in their presentations at the end. It's a little bit difficult due to time constraints. If you have a lot of time to do a deluxe version of lesson jamming, maybe 4 or 5 hours, it might be interesting to develop this idea. So, lessons learned. I've learned a lot about putting on this type of event over the last 11 months. As I've already said, lesson jamming in the form that I'm presenting it to you today developed with experience and from the involvement of all the participants to date. These are some of the things that I've learned from staging lesson jams. So timing, it's something that I've already talked about a bit. In the plan that I'm presenting today, time is added for slippage. All the different parts don't add up to 3 hours. If you want to change the length of different stages, you can do that, but just make sure you add a little bit of extra time for the unexpected. There are usually a couple of latecomers, and usually people want to drink coffee and chat during the break for longer than you want them to drink coffee and chat for. So quality not numbers. For the first lesson jam, I was really keen to get 16 teachers to take part so that we could have 4 groups of 4. I'm a little bit more relaxed now. Of course, you need a minimum number of teachers to take part. For the Cairo lesson jam, we had a group of 4 in Berlin, which isn't so many participants, but they all really enjoyed it and seemed to take away a lot from the experience. I think that's the main thing. There's a social side to lesson jamming as well. It's a chance for teachers to have a chat and to get to know each other. Break down some of that isolation that I was talking about. Including a break and not worrying if it overruns a little is part of that. After the first lesson jam, there was still a group of teachers chatting outside after we'd tidied away and were locking up. Going for a drink afterwards could be a part of the social aspect of lesson jamming. So the venue. Each lesson jam has had a different venue so far. Each one has served a purpose well. My favourite venue was my own flat, which I used for the Cairo jam. It wouldn't be big enough for a group of 16, but for a group of 4 it was perfect. It meant that I had everything at hand, a kitchen, a good internet connection, and importantly a few extra bits of equipment that I was familiar with. Importantly, it didn't cost anything. If you can't afford or borrow a meeting room, improvise. Tomorrow, Mark Jones is putting on a jam in a cafe in Tokyo. No doubt it'll come at the cost of a couple of coffees. Okay, on to Skype. Before jamming on Skype, I worried a lot about the microphone. I borrowed a good USB microphone from a school that I worked for. As it turned out, the biggest problem was the speakers on my computer. They just weren't loud enough. As you might have noticed from the slides, the Berlin group moved position during the session. This was so that I could link up my computer to my hi-fi speakers. If you want to do a Skype lesson jam, think about the technical aspect beforehand and then be ready to improvise. So the future. As I've already mentioned, in the very near future, there's a lesson jam taking place in Tokyo tomorrow morning. I think that there is a potential for more international lesson jams to take place via Skype along the lines of the Cairo model. I think that this really has the potential to strengthen ties between groups of teachers, especially those who have little direct contact with colleagues where they work and teach. These jams don't have to involve me. As I said near the beginning, I'm the guy who brings a flip chart paper, makes sure any computers are working, and makes the tea and coffee. You can do that too. It would be marvellous to hear about any lesson jams that take place, of course. I'd like there to be some type of an online record, but it's something that I haven't set up yet. If anyone has any great ideas on how to do that, how to make a record of lesson jamming around the world, please get in touch. In the meantime, I set up a Facebook group for past participants and potential participants. I've also set up a Twitter account to help teachers interested in lesson jamming make contact with each other. A full Skype lesson jam? I don't know. I don't know how and if it would work if every participant was sitting behind their own computer at home. But if you would like to take part in one, or you just like to organise one, I'd be more than happy to support it. That brings me almost to the end. Here is my website, my email address, the Facebook group for lesson jamming, and the very new lesson jamming Twitter handle. And there's also the Twitter handle for Berlin Gas. Please don't hesitate to contact me directly if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd be really happy to help in any way. Or if you stage a lesson jam, I'd really like to hear how it goes. Thanks for listening. Do you have some questions?
They certainly do, Tom. There have been a lot of questions coming in. It's been hard to keep up with the chat, actually. Thank you so much for that. That's really interesting, really encouraging. The most recurring question we've had, actually, is about how people find the time to do this. A lot of people have been saying, I come home, or my colleagues come home after teaching, and they're absolutely shattered, and the last thing they want to do is spend more time out there. And yet, obviously, you've persuaded teachers to do this and find value in doing that. So, how do you find the time, and how do you motivate people to spend their time doing this?
Sure. I think it's a very important question, and it's something that we've kind of been very aware of through these different jams. I mean, to begin with, the lesson jams so far have taken place on a Saturday, so it's a time when maybe teachers have some time to come together. I think the other really important thing is trying to make an event which is attractive to people, that people actually really want to do. I think that lesson jamming has managed to do that. I mean, of course, the final point as well is remembering that with this, like as I said before, there's a social aspect to it as well. So it's not just all about work. There's a bit of fun in there as well, and the chance to meet other people.
Okay, thanks. Question from Monique Wilkinson-Windrich, who asks what feedback you've received from teachers who've used the results of the lesson jamming actually in classrooms.
Sure. This is maybe a point that that I haven't been so good at, kind of following up the lesson jams plans, how they've been used in classrooms. I've certainly used them in my classes, and I've usually modified them a little bit for the class as well. But I think the really important thing with lesson jamming is not so much maybe the end lesson plan that comes out of it, but everything that goes in before that end lesson plan. The chance for teachers to talk about teaching together, to talk about how they teach, the techniques that they use to teach. And then the end lesson plan is something that they can take different parts out of.
So it's as much about professional development and learning from the experiences of your colleagues as it is about the lesson plan that you produce at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Question from Haroon Beg, who asks whether you find this works better in scenarios with more technology in developed countries, or whether it's actually a value more generally.
It depends, essentially. I mean, if you have a group of teachers that you can bring together in one place, you don't need to have Skype. You don't need a computer. All you need is something to write with and something to write on. That's essentially all you need. The technology part comes in if you decide that you want to make a Skype link with teachers in another part of the world.
Okay, so that's the technology there is just facilitating reaching out further. It's not a vital part of the actual system.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, thanks. I had a number of questions from people asking about how you deal with the fact that teachers may be teaching different levels, different aspects, for instance, business English, medical English, general English. And do you find that they bring different perspectives in and that's beneficial, or does it make it more difficult?
I mean, so far, we haven't really separated according to the purpose that the people are the purpose that people are teaching. For example, business English or academic English or whatever, and it's worked. I mean, we've had a lot of positive feedback. And I think maybe it works because you have a mix of different experiences. I think maybe the most interesting kind of conversation that I saw taking place was between a group of English teachers who teach adults with one teacher who teaches children, and she was telling them how she would teach English in a nursery. And it was just fascinating to see how the approach is different, and maybe that's something that those other English teachers don't usually have contact to. Having said all that, if you have a larger group, if you're able to do this, why not separate the groups into different purposes if you think that it works for the participants that you're working with?
Okay, thanks. I've had a couple of questions from people who are perhaps slightly more skeptical about human nature. So Herman Chan suggested this would be more difficult to achieve in his culture, the culture he's teaching, where schools and teachers are extremely competitive and try to keep their secret techniques to themselves. And Doris has suggested that is there sometimes a touch of competition and people who are there to take rather than to give? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's one of the problems that that lesson jamming is trying to address. I don't think that competition is. I think in the Berlin context, I don't think it's too big a problem, but of course you can see that it is a potential problem at times. And one of the reasons that we try to bring teachers together is just to get teachers working together, because everybody can learn, everybody can take something away from working together. I think that's an underlying belief in the lesson jamming idea. And I think that if you want to sell it to teachers who are who are maybe a little bit skeptical, you just have to say, well, you can take something away from this. You can to begin with, you can learn from other teachers. Secondly, something quite concrete is that you take away a lesson plan which you can use at the end of the session.
Thanks. Just have an interesting idea come in from Angelina Kopachevskaya, who mentions that some of the more introvert teachers may come up with ideas sort of following on from the session, or they may actually come up with ideas afterwards. Do you have any system in place for people being able to share ideas that come up actually after the session's finished?
Um, there's there's the Facebook group that we just set up.
Oh, yes.
And there's yeah, I mean, I guess that would be the best platform at the moment, is a Facebook group that we have working. If anybody's interested in helping me develop this to provide an online record for lesson jamming and a place where people can interact after the lesson jam, I'd be really grateful for any ideas. The one thing that I'd say about kind of introverted teachers is, because I can identify with that a little bit, is that we try to get around that a little bit right at the beginning by giving teachers the chance to brainstorm their ideas on their own for those first 3 minutes.
Oh, yes.
So that then they have their concrete ideas on their plan, on their piece of paper, so then they know that they are going to transfer what's on their piece of paper onto the flip chart paper and share those ideas.
Excellent, thanks. Now we've got a. So I've just missed. I had a question there for a moment, which I just managed to lose. I apologise. So we had a couple of questions about the number of people who can make this work. I mean, do you have a particular sort of minimum beyond which it's not really viable? Or, I mean, you mentioned about dividing up potentially.
So the important thing is that you have an even number of groups. I think that if you're doing this in maybe one place, it does create quite a nice energy if you have 4 groups working there. But essentially, you could do this with 2 groups. And I'd suggest that you need at least 3 people in each group. Yeah, it depends on your situation, but I'd say you probably need a minimum of 6 people to really make it work.
Okay, thanks. Doris Ellen Nitskin has asked whether it's possible to hire you for a Lesson Jam coaching meeting to overcome fears about it. So I think, Doris, if you email Tom, he should be able to answer you on that, I think, because you've got Tom's email on the screen.
Sure.
Rita's pointed out that on the Facebook page it says the group's closed. Was that a question just that people need to send a request to join that?
Yeah, they just need to send a request because it's not open to the whole world. Essentially, I mean, I think it's better with a little bit of privacy. But if you request to join, I will accept your request. No problem.
Okay, thanks. Going back to the thing of recording and sharing ideas after recording, I think one group actually that manages to do this quite effectively is around the ELT chat hashtag, I think the weekly discussions there, where somebody actually records and writes a summary of each of those. I guess that might be a good idea to sort of tag along with this. A question from Bernadette Hagen, who says, lesson jamming involves teacher-created material rather than published material. I mean, have you ever tried sort of working with published material and developing that, or is it always you're starting from 0 point?
Yeah, it's, so far it is like really starting from this 0 point of the stimulus, just to really allow kind of teachers to open their minds as much as possible and to just to be as creative as possible in that first stage. I think you could certainly kind of tweak the idea to maybe use maybe a piece of published material at the beginning, and then to brainstorm around that, and then to develop on from that. I think the idea is adaptable.
Okay, thanks. Ranjini Sasikumar has asked about how you organise those meetings, how you sort of go about starting one up now. I mean, is there anything you do differently to start one up?
Yes, I mean, like essentially, I guess the most important thing is that you have some type of contact with other teachers. Of course, there are different ways that you could do that. Maybe you have friends who are teachers, or you could post on a Facebook group or on a Twitter account, for example, or maybe through the local kind of professional association. That would also be another possibility to find teachers. But for the lesson jam itself, essentially all you need is somewhere quiet that you can stay for a few hours, and that you have pens and paper on hand. That's essentially all you need.
Great, thanks. Interesting question from John Adoro Agibinti, who asks about whether you ever involve any of the authorities at the places you teach.
As in the
I guess
like
the directors of
schools or kind of state schools.
Yes, I guess so. That, or for instance, owners of language schools as well, maybe.
It's not something that we've done so far. No. I think it could be an interesting idea. Maybe especially maybe with the state sector in Germany. I think that could be quite a fruitful exchange. But it's not something we've tried yet.
Okay, thanks. A question from Haroon Beg, who asks what you do to sort of keep your different types of learners in mind before you're planning a lesson with lesson jamming. I mean, do you think very much about the learner needs, or?
I mean, I think it's quite an important thing that actually in the first 3 stages we don't think too much about the learners, because the brainstorming part, it's really just associative thinking. What do you how do you react to the apple or the tin of sausage which is on the table? And then it's during the 4th stage, during the lesson planning, that you're really trying to think in a concrete way about who are the learners going to be. Who is this lesson jam? Who is this lesson plan aimed at? So it's really that 4th stage which is important for that.
Okay, thanks. Question from Christian Soto Chandley, who asks how you encourage teachers to participate. Perhaps, for instance, teachers who've come along out of interest, so have the basic interest, but then maybe don't say very much. Any techniques for that?
I mean, I'll be completely honest with you. So far, we just haven't had a problem. People have been really enthusiastic here in Berlin, in Frankfurt as well, and Cairo. I think everybody has understood the idea quite quickly, and they just get down to work and just start talking, and then it's more of a problem to stop people talking than to really get them talking.
Excellent. One final question. What would you say was the single most valuable thing that's come out of these sessions?
I think the most valuable thing is the fact that teachers have been brought together, and they've been brought together to talk about teaching and to learn from each other, and hopefully that's something that's going to continue happening in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Tom. That's been really interesting. There's been a lot of discussion going on, real enthusiasm, real interest, and people thinking about quite how they can make this happen. I'm really pleased also that we've got lots of people in the chat who've actually been saying, trying to get in touch with each other, finding out email addresses so that they can try this either online or locally. So that's I think quite a great endorsement of what you've been talking about there. People
Sure.
are persuaded and are very keen. So that's great. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. But don't forget, everyone, that we'll be back in 2 weeks' time on August the 26th, when Lynn Durrant will be talking about motivating young learners. 2 weeks after that, on September the 9th, Alan Pulvaness will be presenting a session on adapting published materials to fit your needs. And then on September the 23rd, Sarah Mercer is our host for What About Me? Language Teacher Psychology and Professional Wellbeing. And on October the 7th, Tony Prince joins us for a talk on culture and critical thinking. So you can sign up for all of those webinars on our webinars page in Cambridge English Teacher. Some of them will be for members only, but some of them will also be open should be open to guests and members. The recording of today's webinar should be live in our resources section next week, and you should all receive an emailed certificate of attendance for today's webinar within the next week or so. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, for coming up with so many ideas and so many interesting questions, but most of all, thank you to Tom for a really engaging and highly motivating session. Thanks very much.